George Soros spoke at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend, contrasting his vision of the ideal world order with the rising nationalism in places like Russia, China, and India.
India is an interesting case. It's a democracy, but its leader, Narendra Modi, is no Democrat. Inciting violence against Muslims was an important factor in his meteoric rise. Modi maintains close relations with both open and closed societies. India is a member of the Quad, which also includes Australia, the US, and Japan. But it buys a lot of Russian oil at a steep discount and makes a lot of money out of it.
And just yesterday at the Munich Security Conference, George Soros spoke on many issues, but specifically on open and closed societies, and called on institutional reform in India. How do you, as Foreign Minister of India, explain this when you're dealing with your Quad ministers in particular, as well as others?
Well, look, I actually made 2 points. One, how the world is changing. It is rebalancing. It is less Euro-Atlantic. I don't think everybody gets that. I think old habits die hard. I mean, very candidly, there are still people in the world who believe that their definition, their preferences, their views must override everything else. So, since you mentioned this specific example, I don't know how familiar people are with what was said at the Munich conference. Essentially, Mr. Soros said India is a democratic country, but he doesn't think the Prime Minister of India is a Democrat. By the way, a few years ago, in the same conference, I was there at that time, he actually accused us of planning to strip millions of Muslims of their citizenship, which of course didn't happen. It was a ridiculous suggestion. But you have to understand what this actually means. I could take a view that the individual in question, Mr. Soros, is a old, rich, opinionated person sitting in New York who still thinks that his views should determine how the entire world works. Now, if I could only stop at old, rich and opinionated, I would put it away. But he is old, rich, opinionated and dangerous. Because what happens is when such people and such views and such organizations, they actually invest resources in shaping narratives.
That's right. Soros is old, rich, opinionated, and dangerous. That coming from India's Minister of External Affairs. And what he just said about Soros is perfect. Soros, when all is said and done, can claim he's a Democrat until he's blue in the face. It doesn't change the fact that he's doing everything he possibly can to orchestrate world events irrespective of voter will and intention. To me, that's what makes Soros so diabolical when all's said and done. He virtue signals. He reputation launders under the guise of democratic open societies, when in point of fact, behind the scenes, he's doing absolutely everything he can to undermine the will of voters. And Minister Jaishankar called him out on it. As many of you know, Soros' thought and activist career or organized around the idea of what he calls the open society. He actually gets the term from Karl Popper in his classic work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And according to Popper, open societies are rational societies, whereas closed societies are inherently irrational. So open societies guarantee and protect rational exchange centered on the individual, whereas closed societies force people to submit to authorities, particularly traditionalist authorities, religious, political, economic, what have you. Now, laying aside the obvious critique that Soros is blatantly committing an either-or fallacy, or the fallacy of what we call the excluded middle. In other words, there are clearly more conceivable options than either an open or closed society. Laying that aside, most agree that Soros' defining intellectual principle is cosmopolitan internationalism, the notion that the world should constitute a single global community that transcends nationalisms, tribalisms, and sovereign states. Many do not recognize that probably the most galvanizing factor for all this is the role that apocalyptic environmentalism plays in Soros' philosophy. Soros sees the planet as basically expiring, and only the galvanizing the world's populations into a fully cooperative global community can we hope to overcome this ecological challenge. So interestingly, apocalyptic environmentalism appears to be the motivating factor that's galvanizing his web of billion-dollar NGOs that interfere into the politics of sovereign nations across the planet. And again, this is what's so key to the nefarious nature of Soros. If, for him, what's at stake is the very survival of the planet, then populations cannot possibly be allowed to choose the wrong leaders. So that's why all this rhetoric about open societies and democracy and human rights is utter bunk. The only legitimate governments are governments that go along with Soros's environmental activism. Unfortunately for Soros, as Jay Shankar made clear, the world is changing. It's moving away from the ability of one guy sitting in a penthouse in New York to dictate to the rest of the world how it's supposed to operate.